and I'm a docent for the Sherfy Farm and also the George Spangler Farm. And I volunteer at the member service desk, or the Friends desk as we call it now, and do different things for the foundation as a volunteer. And one of my favorite places to be on the battlefield is right here at the Sherfy Farm, because it has an awful lot of appeal in many different ways. First of all, as you can see, it's a beautiful spot. It's one of the most beautifully located farms on the entire battlefield. And it's centrally located to the battle itself. And as you can see, it has a tremendous view. You can see the South Mountains all the way over there, and you can look down in that direction and see Big Round Top and part of Little Round Top. So it's an ideally suited place to be. We also have a garden, and I work in the garden too, so I do. So it's always a pleasure because we always get to take some of the goodies home from the garden, but that's how they pay us. They give us a little produce, but most of that goes to either the college campus kitchen in the summer, or to different charities around town that provide food for those in need. So it's really functional, and they'll get almost a ton of food out of that garden in the summertime. And Jolene, Ray's wife, photographer's wife, she's in charge of that. So I volunteer for her, and I volunteer for Ray. So they've got us sewed up.
They're our bosses.
It's always a pleasure to work here in many different ways. And this garden is where it was during the Civil War. Now we don't grow the same types of vegetables because we grow mostly what's known as hybrids. And if you're familiar with gardens, hybrids are types of plants that have been bred to resist disease and resist drought. When Mr. and Mrs. Sherfy had a garden there, they would be growing what we would call today heirloom type of vegetables. And they were more coarse, and they're more difficult to digest, believe me. If you've ever eaten an heirloom tomato compared to a hybrid, you probably the second time around choose the hybrid, because the heirlooms are a little rough, but they're delicious, and some people grow them and like them. But anyway, it's right where it was, and the barn is where it was too, although that's not the barn that was there during the Civil War. The original barn that was there during the battle was burned down on July the 3rd. And unfortunately, there were 14 soldiers from the 114th Pennsylvania who were wounded in that barn that they couldn't get out in time, and they perished. 14 men died there. Mr. Sherfy then rebuilt the barn, and it was rebuilt the year after the war, in 1865, and in 1866 it was struck by lightning and it burned down again. So that was built in 1866 as it is. So Mr. Sherfy rebuilt it, and what you see there is the 1866 barn. And now Joseph Sherfy lived on this particular piece of property as a young man with his parents, and he was born in 1813, and so he was pretty well advanced as a mature young man, or as a mature man by the time the war came. And he didn't marry until he was about 30 years of age. So that was a pretty old to be married back then. Most young men married when they were in their early 20s. But he didn't marry because his parents were elderly, and he stayed on the farm to help them take care of the farm. And he inherited it when his parents died. And he pieced together then 40 acres, because back then you didn't own all farms in continuous or contiguous acreage. Sometimes you own 2 acres here, and then down the road you own 4 more acres. And he consolidated the farm and decided to become a fruit farmer. And he married Mary Hagan. And I'm trying to remember the date without referring to my notes, but I can't. So I can't remember things like I used to. You ever have that problem? Thank you. I'm with a group that understands. That's what I like. Anyway, they purchased this farm, and he built this. Or they didn't purchase it. They purchased some extra pieces of land from the Woods family, and then consolidated it all together into one big 40-acre farm that was continuous acreage. here and on the other side of Emmitsburg Road. And he owned all the way down to the corner where you see those monuments, and that peach orchard belonged to him as well. So when you hear about the battle in the peach orchard, it was Mr. Sherfy's peach orchard that they fought in. And they had this particular parcel of land, and they built this house in 1843. 1843. Now, this house is different now than it was in 1843, because back then it was just a two-bay Georgian front where you had your picture taken out front. It had the door in the middle and windows on either side, top floor and bottom floor. And it had this kitchen where we went in to get lunch. But it was only a one-story kitchen. Now there are bedrooms above it. Okay, and that's the bedroom that was added. So about halfway up, that was added in the 1870s. Now they had 6 children here, 3 girls and 3 boys. And also Mary's, Mrs. Sherfy's mother, Mrs. Hagen. Her name was Catherine. So at the time of the battle, there were 9 people living here. And in the 1870s, they added the second floor, and then a little bit after that, for some reason, I don't know why, he added that section, which is made out of wood. Now, why he attached the wood to the brick, who knows? He's not here to answer a lot of questions that I have for him. But anyway, so what you see now was usually considered complete by the end of the 1870s. This is the house. So when you look on this side of the house, if you want to come over here, I want to show you something that are put there by the Mississippians that were charging this position on July the 2nd, 1863. And as you can see up above on the second floor here in the back where these 2 windows are with the green shutters in the back, you don't see any bullet holes up there because that was added after the war. But down below you can see pock marks and bullet holes that were put there during the battle. So this house suffered considerable damage on July 2nd. And part of the Brethren Church that they belonged to was known as the Dunkards. Okay. They were a pacifist group, and the Dunkards denomination within the Brethren still exists today, and there are some Dunkard churches here in Adams County still active, very active. But they were pacifists. They didn't believe in war, so you can imagine how terrible it must have been for the Sherfys to experience war on their own property. In fact, Mr. Sherfy was ordained as a pastor in the Dunkard church. Now, of course, back then he wasn't working full-time for the church because the congregations were too small and too spread out. He made his living canning peaches, and he was an innovator in the canning process and selling peaches to the public. And he developed this process very successfully. And one of the advantages he had as a farmer who could can his peaches is that he could sell peaches all year long. Now, before the canning process came by, you could only sell your peaches in the late summer when they were in in season. But he canned, and he had a big cannery right over there where the grass was taller. That's where the cannery was, right out his back door. And he was able to can, hundreds and hundreds of cans of peaches and sell them all year long. In fact, he had a very interesting logo that he used, and I got a picture of that. He advertised as fresh peaches, and that was his brand name, and it was well known all over Adams County. He was a very well known canner and made a lot of money, and he was able to live very well. One of the few farmers in this part of the Gettysburg area that was affluent. Down on the southern side, that's where we are, you had families such as the Wentz family and the Warfield family. This is one of those little houses over there. They were subsistence farmers, and they just grew what they ate and had very little left over to sell. But Sherfy was a wealthy man who was able to not only live in a two-bay Georgian, he was able to add on to it, and expand his house. Well, that was not easily done back then. You had to have a lot of money to do that. And he did. He was, pardon me, very well to do. Very well to do. And so he was able to be one of the more wealthy men who lived in this part of the Gettysburg area. Now, there was also a few others who were pretty well to do, including Henry Spangler, who had that farm right there. That's an original farm to the time of the battle. And also the Fedori family up on the Emmitsburg Road, and the Bliss farm also. They were pretty well-to-do farmers in this part of town. The Klingon Farm, which is still here right around the corner, that was more of a subsistence farm. If you ever want to read an interesting story of the Klingon family, it's a tragic story. You should look up on Google the Klingon Farm, Gettysburg. It's the story of this neighborhood is just incredible. But anyway, Joseph was able to do a lot with his property and improve it and make money off of it. Now, during the battle, he had about 1,000 peach trees. In that area, right across the road, was a new orchard that he had recently planted about 2 years before the war. And the established peach orchard down there was producing the majority of his peaches. And out of 1,000 peach trees, he lost about 700 during the battle. Now, they weren't intentionally destroyed, because most of the men on the Union and Confederate side, on both sides, were farmers, because these were volunteer armies. They weren't drafted armies. They were volunteers, and they were volunteers from the world of farming. So they respected the land they fought on both sides. They didn't intentionally tear down his trees, but the cannon fire especially was so severe on July 2nd, on July 3rd, those trees suffered greatly, and he lost most of them. He had to replant them. And it took a couple years for that to be reestablished. But anyway, on July 1st, he and his family saw the first corps of John Reynolds coming up the Emmitsburg Road, right in front of the house. And I can only imagine what their religious beliefs as being pacifist must have really been sad to see huge armies passing in front of their house. But what they did was they put big barrels of water along the road in front of the house here, so that the soldiers could get a drink of water. And they were constantly, from the well, filling those barrels up all day long to supply those soldiers as they came by. And Mrs. Sherfy and her mother were baking bread on July 1st and just made as much bread as they could, and as it came out of the oven, they were passing it out to the soldiers. And the soldiers were extremely grateful for that, that's for sure. The day before that, on the 30th of June, General Buford's cavalry came up the road. So for several days, they just saw soldiers coming into the Gettysburg area. These were Union soldiers at the time. Any questions so far? Yes?
When you say cans, were they in cans or jars?
They were in jars.
And was he ever given back money to compensate him for the loss of his peaches?
No. He applied, just like most of these farmers had lost all their crops that year, that summer. They applied to the federal government for reimbursement. And the federal government, they sort of had a way of saying, well, how did your farm get destroyed? If you said the Confederates did it, they said, that's not our fault. So we're not going to give you any money back. And if they said the Union did it, well, they would probably give you 5 cents on the dollar. That was about it. The federal government wasn't real good about reimbursing, because there were so many farmers in Pennsylvania that suffered losses, and they tried to narrow down their responsibility as much as possible. So they didn't recover much of anything at all. I'm trying to think. The George Spangler farm, he put in for $1,200 and he got $63 back. So it shows you about what the average farmer would get. That's an excellent question. Yeah.
So you said that there was so much cannon fire it destroyed the orchards, but did none of the cannons hit the house?
It did. Yeah, they did. There were big holes in the roof. There were big holes in the barn. It didn't escape that. In fact, the cannon fire is what caused the barn to catch on fire on July the 3rd, because the Union was firing back from that direction along where Pickett's charge took place. But the Confederates were lined up all the way along the road here, the Confederate Avenue. and they were firing in both directions, and it hit the grass, which was tall grass. They didn't cut much grass back then, like we do today. And the wind blew it against the end of the barn and caught it on fire. And they got all but 14 out of the 30-some men that were in there. They got all but 14 out of there. But yeah, that was unfortunate. But the Confederates and the Union both had their artillery in place on this particular property. On July the 2nd, the Sherfys were told to leave with their 6 children and Grandma. Well, Grandma came out here because she had clothes on the line. And the Mississippians, there were the Barksdale's Mississippians, you had a whole division over there. There was the 18th, the 19th, and the 13th, and each one of those regiments had about 250 to 500 men. So if you can imagine this whole area along that tree line over there, just filled with Confederates. And they started marching in this direction. And the 3rd Corps from Dan Sickles, he was the Corps commander, lined up his regiments. He had the 114th Zouaves, which is that statue right there. He had the 57th Pennsylvania, that was a Pennsylvania regiment. He had the 63rd down at the corner, and he had the 105th next to that. So he had 4 regiments here. But those men only had about 100, regiments had about 150 in each regiment. And as a result, they were greatly outnumbered, and they were out of place. They shouldn't have been there to begin with. And Buckland's Rhode Island battery was along this road. And they had to, these men of the 114th had to protect that cannon battery. There were 6 cannons that were firing at those Confederates, but they were overwhelmed because the Confederates outnumbered the Union 4-1. Even though all these men were from Pennsylvania, they were fighting on their own soil. They were trying to defend Pennsylvania, not just the Union. And they came back after the war and built these monuments to their regiment and to the men who died here. I have a picture that I want to show you real quick before we go inside. I know as the sun came out, all of a sudden it's getting hot. This is a picture of the house and the garden. Now this picture is hanging on the inside of this house. You can see the original picture, but it shows the 114th Zouaves. You know, they dressed as French Foreign Legion soldiers. They had on red pants and white blouses and fezzes for hats. And they were fighting right through here. Where we're standing is where the Confederates were, and on the other side of the garden is where the 114th were. They were firing rifles at each other. This is another picture while we're outside. It shows the house without the 2nd story on it that was built in the 1870s. But this is between 1863 and 1869. You can see the house there in the photograph. But this was a place where you're standing with where hand-to-hand combat took place. And many men and many animals also died right at the ground upon which you're standing. Okay. Any questions? You can see a bigger picture of this inside. Tell you what, the truth, I'm not sure.
Yes, they
Those
are.
currents?
For currents, yep.
Okay, yeah, she would know because she works here a lot.
Okay. Yeah, we had
Thank
those up,
heavens for Kendra.
we had those up at
We're all one big happy family.
We are. Some family members like you work harder than family members like me.
What happened to grandmother?
What happened to Grandma? Well, there's an interesting story. On July the 2nd, she came out to take down the laundry, and those Confederates were coming across the field. And they were fighting, and there was another fence over here. A bullet went through the fence and went through the folds of her dress. Of course, she wore dresses. She was a Dunkard. She wore dresses even on July the 2nd all the way to the ground. And the bullet went through the folds of her dress and fell on the ground in front of her. And she picked it up and went in the house, and she said, "I think it's time for us to leave." And they did. That's when they finally left.
Clothes off the line? Did she get her clothes off the line?
That I don't know.
I'm sure she did. Laundry is always there for you.
I was gonna
Husbands
say,
come and go,
Rosemary.
kids come and go, laundry is always
You're
there.
absolutely
their relatives still.
Yes,
Got the bullet and then took
2006,
out
the
the
Sherfys had a
Yeah.
family reunion here because they had 6 children. And they say Mrs. Sherfy had another baby after the war, but that would have made her 45 or 46 years old. That's entirely possible. So as a total, she had 7 children, only 6 of which were here during the war. And they had a big family reunion here at the farm in 2006. That was the last time they got together. But the Sherfy family is still alive. After the war was over, Mr. Sherfy died at age 70 in 1882, I believe, and Mrs. Sherfy lived in 1904 when she passed away. So, but yeah, those are good questions about the family. They returned to the farm on July the 6th, and they found their entire house torn to pieces because the Confederates took it over. There were dead soldiers and dead animals all around their property. The barn had been burned to the ground. The bodies of 14 men were still in that barn, and all these fields were just horribly covered with the dead and the wounded. And many were still wounded and not even removed from the field by July the 6th. But they rebuilt their farm and became prosperous once again. The soldiers would come back from these units, these Pennsylvania units, and they would hold summer reunions here, and the Sherfys welcomed them back. Mrs. Sherfy would provide food, and the men would make contributions to the family, but she would cook for all these men. They would give her pictures. She had one wall in her house just covered with photographs of the soldiers who fought here, but they came back to remember their comrades who died here, and the Sherfys would welcome them until they got too old. And finally, when she passed away in 1904, they kept the house, but the family kept the farm but rented it out, and the National Park Service, I believe in 1997, bought it from the family, and it's been in the National Park Service ever since. It's owned by the National Park, but it's leased by the Gettysburg Foundation. Okay, I'm going to pass around a picture that was taken on the other side of the house, facing the house, and it's a picture of an old cherry tree with a cannonball in it, because that tree caught that cannonball before it hit the house. And the Sherfys always pointed that out to people that came to visit, because it was not just the soldiers who came to visit this property, but the public would often stop by because everybody knew how historic this farm was. The old trolley line ran right in front of the house down the Emmitsburg Road all the way over to the Little Round Top. Little Round Top, had an amusement park and a tavern and some other things over there too. It was all commercialized. Likewise, up until the 1960s, there was between here and the end of the road, there was a Stuckey's, there was a Texaco station. On this side, there was a hotel, and that was all taken down to restore it to the way it was. So people would stop and get off the trolley and come and visit the house. They'd just come knock on the door. And the Sherfys were used to that. And they would show them around and also show them the cannonball in the tree. That cannonball is now in the possession of the Adams County Historical Society. So we're standing now in one of the original parts of the house, including the original floor that has been redone and preserved. And this fireplace, that was here at the time. However, the refrigerator and the gas stove was not. But Mrs. Sherfy would have loved to have it. Yeah. She had to cook on an open stove like that, and she did. She was able to do that. The other thing, the last picture I want to pass around before we move, and we're going to move through the whole house, is a picture of Robert and Thaddeus Kennerdyne. These are the Kennerdyne Brothers. Robert was a part of the 114th Pennsylvania Zouaves. You can tell by his distinctive uniform. They were from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and they were Quakers. Now, Quakers were pacifists too, and they didn't believe in war, but these boys felt so strongly about the fact that they could help free the slaves by defeating the South that they joined the Army, and they wrote letters of apology to their parents for becoming members of an army, because that was a sinful thing to do if you were a Quaker. It still is, if you're a Quaker, because they're conscientious objectors. However, Robert never made it home. He was shot here in the garden, and he died a little later on July 15th. So he lived about 2 weeks after being shot. He was in a field hospital when he died, and he had with him that photograph of his brother Thaddeus on his possession when he was shot. And of course the Confederates rummaged through the bodies of the fallen Union, and one of the Confederates from Mississippi took took Thaddeus's picture off of his brother Robert's body. And it was a number of years after the war that his conscience bothered him, and he did everything he could. It had his name on the back of the picture. He looked him up. He looked Thaddeus up and gave him the picture back.
Oh, wow.
So he did, yeah. Confederate soldier's name was John Hawthorne, and he was from Mississippi, and he returned the photo to Thaddeus. But that's a human interest story of the Civil War.
Yeah, it certainly is.
It's great that they did. It's sad that he took the picture to begin with, but it's great that he returned it about 10 years later. Found the family and returned it to them.
Was there any reason why the Zouaves of the one Pennsylvania regiment named themselves that and followed the French
French Foreign
costuming?
Legion.
The French Foreign Legion.
The reason they did it? Because the regiments were allowed to provide their own uniforms. For the federal government, didn't have enough uniforms to outfit all the volunteers. So they said, if you guys want to, wear a certain uniform, just make sure it's all the same. And these guys were enamored with the French Foreign Legion. There were a number of Zouave outfits throughout the Union Army. Yeah, there were more than just 114. But this was the 114th Collis Zouave Regiment. And Collis is buried, Colonel Collis is buried in the National Cemetery here in Gettysburg. And he was a recipient of the Medal of Honor.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
Wow,
they're
that's
colonels.
interesting.
Not for action here, but action in other places. Unfortunately, they were easy to see on the battlefield.
I hadn't thought about that.
There's no camouflage at all, but apparently they didn't care. They provided their own uniform. When the Sherfys came back on July the 6th, the entire house, as I said, was ransacked. The 4 feather beds that were upstairs were unfortunately soaked in blood. All of the dressers were opened and all the contents dumped out. Many of their clothes were ripped up and used for bandages because the Confederates used this as a sort of a temporary hospital. They weren't here very long, but while they were, it was quite a mess. The only thing that wasn't damaged or ruined was a 8-day wind-up clock that was on the mantle. It's not there now, of course, but that was still running, and they never took it. They never damaged it. It was had been wound up before they left, and it was still running when they came back about 6 days later. It was an 8-day clock. That's one of the things they made note of and often pointed out to visitors and the Union soldiers that came back to visit. During the second day of the battle, the Sherfys had left, and the Union members of the 57th Regiment, whose monument's up the street here a little bit, were in the house and using it as a sniper's nest, you might say, to fire at the Confederates as they were coming across the field, because in that direction, all the way to that direction, from the south all the way over to the west, had regiment after regiment of Mississippians. They were all from Mississippi coming across these fields. And Lieutenant Allenson Nelson saw the Confederates moving faster than he realized or thought they would move, because the resistance from the 114th was collapsing. He got inside the house and went upstairs and told the sharpshooters to get out, and he waited until they all went down the stairs and out the front door and moved up the Emmitsburg Pike, and he came down the steps and looked out that window where you're standing, and he could see less than 50 yards away the Confederates moving forward. There was a bunch of them together. As he looked out the window, they recognized him because he had his uniform on. They asked him to surrender, and he said no. He jumped out that window and ran up through the garden, and at the other end there was another fence. He jumped over that fence and they were shooting at him, and he escaped. He was able to get away, but fortunately, with his life. And he wrote later about his escape, and he said, "I remember jumping over a fence, and I never touched it." So he was running pretty fast and never stopped. So his name was Alonson Nelson of the 57th Pennsylvania. The Rhode Island Buckland Battery of cannon were moved up the Emmitsburg Road, and then the 114th provided cover so they could pull up and get away, and also the 57th. And then across the street, if you noticed if you were here, I can see it from where I'm standing, there's a statue of, or a monument to the 73rd New York. Okay, those were New York people, and one of the men on the statue has a fireman's hat on. And they were called the Fire Zouaves because that regiment was made up of New York City firemen. So they were the 73rd New York, and they provided cover for the 114th to get away. And then, of course, they had to fall away too. That was known as the Excelsior Brigade, and that's the Excelsior Monument. They were New Yorkers, and of course, all of these units were from the 3rd Corps of Dan Sickles. I don't know if you know the story about him, but that's another lecture for another time. He was quite a scoundrel and disobeyed orders and put these men in harm's way. He should not have been here, but this is where they were when the Mississippians attacked. Okay, any questions?
How many men died from that unit?
They had about 40 to 50% casualties and captured, unfortunately. Yeah. So they were using, the 114th was using the barn as a hospital, but they lost all the property. And the Confederates only held it, of course, for another day, until the 3rd after Pickett's charge. But this was right in the middle. Well, Pickett's charge took place all along here. Most of the time when you go to the angle, you hear about Pickett's charge, but Pickett's charge was much wider than that. It was a mile wide. And they were all converging in one point. And the high water mark is that point they were converging towards the copse of trees, they call it. But when they started out, they were all along this area too. So they went over this particular property. So that well. The door here goes up to the attic, which we won't go up there because I can't get up there myself. But interestingly enough, many of these farms, including the Sherfys, would raise silkworms in their attic to make silk out of it. Yeah, a lot of the farmers did that. Where you're standing now is original house. This room and that room over there are original. Now that wasn't a bathroom at the time. The bathroom was out in the corner of the garden. They may have had that as a storage area, but
In closets.
yeah, I want you to eventually go down there, and in the hallway, you'll see 2 holes right against that with the far wall. Okay, the bullets that made those holes came in that window, went through that wall, and went through this wall and came out in the bedroom. You can look out here and see the bullet holes in the bedroom. So those are bullet holes from the battle. The Sherfy just left there. Imagine the power behind that bullet to go through a window and 2 walls before it was finally spent. This section was added on after the war, about the 1870s. This part, the front, is over the kitchen, and that section over there is over the mudroom. So.